good Shane. I knew it. I knew it just as well as anything. Was that him? Was that Wilson?
That was him. That was Wilson, all right. He was fast. Fast on the draw. Joey, what are you doing here?
I'm sorry, Shane.
You don't have to be. You better run back.
Can I ride home behind you?
Afraid not, Joey.
Please, why not?
I gotta be going on.
Why, Shane?
Man has to be what he is, Joey. Can't break the mold. I tried it and it didn't work for me.
We want you, Shane.
Joey, there's no living with a killing. There's no going back from one. Right and wrong, it's a brand. A brand sticks. There's no going back. Now you run on home to your mother and tell her everything's all right. And there aren't any more guns in the valley.
Shane. It's bloody. You're hurt.
I'm all right, Joey. You go home to your mother and your father and grow up to be strong and straight. Joey, take care of them. Both of them.
Yes, Shane.
From the 1953 classic film Shane, there's Alan Ladd and the classic story of violence branding a person for life. And you know the film, perhaps do you know the director, who not only directed Shane, but many other American classics. His name is George Stevens, and he's in the spotlight on tonight's edition of the movie show, Take Two on Public Radio, KCBX, broadcasting from San Luis Obispo, California. In order to have this great discussion, I've got my good friend with me. It's Bob Whiteford.
And across the aisle from me, the undisputed czar of film on the Central Coast, if not, in fact, the whole world. A man I'm proud to call my friend. Of course, I'm talking about Jim Dee. And Jimmy, we're going to do George Stevens tonight.
And before we begin, a double thank you to our avid listener in Sydney, Australia. Don't you love streaming? Dave Salton has been in contact with us and is an avid listener living in Australia. And at least we have one bona fide listener in Down Under. But boy, streaming is great. But Dave, we really want to thank you for listening, for your letters. But it was Dave Salton who suggested George Stevens. And, Bob, when I first heard the name or just thought about doing a show, a few titles came to mind. And then, of course, as usual, I do the research. We both do the research, and the career and the scope of his work, of the work of George Stevens, goes from the unbelievable to the mind-boggling. He was a director, producer, screenwriter, and maybe first and foremost, a cinematographer.
This is an interesting story, Jim, and I don't think it's been told, at least not any time recently. I might add that the actor with Alan Ladd in that opening clip is the great child star Brandon DeWilde. I don't know, for whatever reason. I remembered that one.
Worth the mention.
But George Stevens is an interesting story. He comes from a time when filmmakers made lots of movies, when the studio system was churning them out right and left. But he was a director that kind of bucked that trend. He was not a prolific filmmaker, especially when he hit his stride after World War II. And that's a story in itself, his war experiences, which we'll go into in great detail. But he was the first filmmaker from that era, aside from maybe Charlie Chaplin, that I could think of that would take a long time getting their films made. They would take, sometimes in, I think the case of The Greatest Story Ever Told, his version of the Bible, it took 5 years to make.
That's correct. I read that too.
And that is highly unusual for that era in particular, if not in filmmakers really in general for all time.
Well, I'm really glad you brought up Charlie Chaplin because of his process of movie making where he would take after take, they'd be filming sequences. He was almost writing when he was filming. And George Stevens apparently loved to get 10 different camera angles for every scene. Apparently he has he drove the editing room crazy because apparently there was so much footage, but also George Stevens was a noted perfectionist. He either knew what he wanted or he wanted to have enough to go in and create the picture that he wanted. And I guess the other director that has this notorious reputation, notorious or not, is the Stanley Kubrick, who is known to do a lot of takes and a lot of processing of getting to where he wants to be. So I'm sure there are others, but I think those are three guys who like to shoot film: Charlie Chaplin, George Stevens, and Stanley Kubrick.
And quite a trifecta of three great filmmakers. And tonight we're focusing on George Stevens.
Here's the basic information. He's a Californian. George Stevens, born December 18th, 1904 in Oakland, California. He died in Lancaster, California in 1975 at the age of 70. He's won a couple of Oscars for Best Director, A Place in the Sun and Giant, also a handful of nominations, including The More the Merrier, Shane, and The Diary of Anne Frank. Best Picture nominations under his directorial hand include The Talk of the Town, The More the Merrier, A Place in the Sun, Shane, Giant, and The Diary of Anne Frank. But Bob, I really want to start with George Stevens in the early years because this guy was in the movies. Apparently he skipped school to, go do some acting when he was about 5. But he was working in film way early on. And what I love about his history and then looking at a lot of his films is the fact that he was a cameraman for the Hal Roach Studios, who churned out all those Little Rascals and Laurel and Hardy shorts and films. And George Stevens was right there, like you say, the movie factory where they churned out shorts and films, and George Stevens was right there. And here's an interesting note, too. The first film we're going to be talking about, at least with a clip, is Stevens teaming up with Katharine Hepburn in 1935 in a film called Alice Adams. And what's really been intriguing, Bob, is in all the biographies and what I have been reading about George Stevens is, well, he got his big break in 1935 with Alice Adams and this wonderful performance from Katharine Hepburn. Well, big break. In 1935, George Stevens directed Bridal Veil, Hunger Pains, Laddie, The Nitwits, Alice Adams, and Annie Oakley. I don't think he needed a big break. I think he was working a lot. I think he was in demand as a great cinematographer and director. And, of course, the big break came with Katharine Hepburn in this spirited film, which we'll play a clip from. But, it's interesting. He seemed to be working hard, in demand, and a break or not, he was in the thick of it.
Well, this is interesting, Jim, because here he is coming out of the gate, and he's churning out a half dozen films a year. I think he probably owes a lot to Hal Roach. He probably learned a lot from him, churning out the Little Rascals and the Laurel and Hardy shorts, all of which were of excellent quality. And here he is, 1935, making a half dozen films, and you think ahead, just briefly, that in, say, 1948, 49, he's making maybe one film every other year. And this is interesting. I mean, he's paid his dues. He's learned the hard way. I mean, in the 20s, throughout the 20s, he worked on dozens of films a year. I mean, this guy brought his lunch pail, and he learned the hard way. And 1935, he directs a half dozen films. Alice Adams scores big with a very young Fred MacMurray, an Academy Award-nominated performance for Katharine Hepburn, and Annie Oakley is a fairly big hit, too, with Barbara Stanwyck. So he scores big with his last two films of 1935.
And in all that the research that we've been doing on George Stevens, there is one link in all of his films, even though what I love about George Stevens is his films are so diverse, so different. I mean, when you go from one film to another, later on we'll go from Giant to The Diary of Anne Frank, I couldn't imagine a bigger quantum leap in subject matter and approach to filmmaking. But there is that thread of humanity that seems to run through all of George Stevens' films, and really playing out nicely with the way he treats his actors. And, you know, some of his films may be a little dated or maybe borderline a little soapy, a little soap opera-ish, but I mean in the best sense of the word. But there's still that core of people and full-blown characters, and you know, just in the clips and the bits I was watching to get myself ready for the show, Bob, I saw it. I saw these wonderful dramatic things that he does to endear you to the character, to make the characters more full-blown, more human, and you know, showing their faults. So let's listen to this clip from Alice Adams, from considered the big break for George Stevens, who was already working overtime, it seems. From 1935, Katharine Hepburn, Fred MacMurray, both looking very, very young, and they're very romantic. Here's a scene. I should set it up that Fred MacMurray is from a very hoity-toity, pompous family, and he's very smitten by Katharine Hepburn's very down-to-earth and truthful nature. This is from Alice Adams.
What are you thinking of?
I think I was just being sort of sadly happy then.
Sadly happy?
Mm-hmm. Don't you know? Only children can be just happily happy. I think when we get older, some of our happiest moments are like this one. It's like that music. Oh, so sweet. And oh, so sad.
But what makes it sad for you?
I don't know. Perhaps it's a kind of useless foreboding I seem to have pretty often. I'm afraid I'm going to miss these summer evenings of ours when they're over.
Do they have to be over?
Mm-hmm. Everything's over, sometime.
Oh, don't let's look so far ahead. We don't have to already be thinking of the cemetery, do we?
Our summer evenings will be over before that, Arthur Russell.
Why?
Oh, good heavens. There's laconic eloquence for you. Almost a proposal in a single word.
Well,
Oh, don't worry. I shan't hold you to it. No, but something will interfere. Somebody will, I mean. You know, people talk about each other fearfully in this town. They don't always stop at the truth. They make things up. Yes, they do, really.
Well, what difference does it all make?
It's just that I'd rather they didn't make things up about me to you.
I'd know they weren't true.
Wouldn't it be wonderful if two people could just keep themselves to themselves? If they could manage to be friends without people talking about them?
Well, we've done that pretty well so far, haven't we? And if you want our summer evenings to be over, you'll have to drive me away yourself.
No one else could.
No one.
Well, I won't.
That is Katharine Hepburn and Fred MacMurray, very young, in the 1935 Alice Adams, directed by George Stevens. And, you know, what's interesting about this film, Bob, too, we talked about George Stevens coming out of the Hal Roach Studios. And there are moments in this, and, you know, later on we're going to be looking at Woman of the Year, which is Katharine Hepburn's team up with Spencer Tracy for the first time. And in both of these films, maybe even a little bit more in Alice Adams, there are scenes that have a borderline muted slapstick to them. And I'm thinking here, you know, I'm watching this and realizing that he had worked with the Hal Roach Studios and Laurel and Hardy and Little Rascals. And the comedy, you know, permeates his films, even in the dramas. I mean, the great touch of George Stevens' direction is the fact that he can balance comedy and drama, thrills and chills, and other elements. But you know, in this film, there's a dinner table scene in Alice Adams, and I think Alice Adams' father's shirt comes open when he's eating. I mean, it's muted slapstick, but I can almost see where it's coming from, and it adds a really nice touch to the films of George Stevens.
Absolutely, Jimmy. In fact, this little bit that you played, it's kind of got a touch of melancholy to it, and that's, you know, for a romance, it's kind of interesting. It's not your typical romantic stuff. There seems to be a little bit of thought, a little bit of melancholy to it all. It's kind of interesting, and of course, it seems very much in character for Katharine Hepburn when she was young and beautiful to be talking about the end of life as you're falling in love with someone. That's a poignant little scene, I think, for his career and also for her career.
She's a realist in the fact that I think he comes from a world of pomp and circumstance and facades and you know, phoniness, and she's just down to earth. She would rather tell the truth. She doesn't want people talking about them. I mean, she's just and what's really wonderful is Fred McMurray. You can just tell why he's smitten with her in this film.
Absolutely.
That's Alice Adams from 1935, directed by George Stevens. And let's move on to Swing Time, which is another, shall we say, a great addition to the George Stevens resume in the fact that he directed Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. And, you know, a lot of those films, as wonderful as they are, they're almost like little set pieces for the dance numbers that are in between. And in this one, there's some real fun antics. There's some great stuff going on. And again, the touch of George Stevens in this film, not only choreographing the dance scenes, but the comedy and the interplay of the actors. It's great stuff.
You know, Jimmy, I dare I say it, this might be the best of the Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers films.
I believe they say it is. I mean, I need to see all of them to make that comparison.
But boy, they're not only dancing up a storm, but they're showing a lot of electricity off the dance floor, and they make a great comedy, like a light romantic comedy, which was huge in the 30s. They make a great team, and this film really cements the duo together, and this is a lot of fun. I think it also features Edward Everett Horton, who I happen to love a lot too.
Oh, he's great. And make note that we mentioned that George Stevens made about 5-6 features in 1935. Swing Time made in 1936. Here's a clip from Swing Time. It's self-explanatory, of course, the great Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers.
Well, here I am.
Young man, why didn't you appear for your wedding?
I thought you'd ask me that.
Well, don't stand there like a statue. You said you were going to do something. Well, do it. Well, what are you going to do? Don't you dare touch him.
Well, why don't you do something?
I will. I will, but, well,
Pardon me, I think I'm in the way. Perhaps you two would like to be alone.
You stay right where you are. I'm not finished with you yet.
I had a feeling you weren't.
I wouldn't let you marry her for $10,000.
How about 20?
Not for 20,000.
25?
Not for 25. Say, young man, where could you get $25,000? My dancing? Yeah, and there's another thing. Coming back to your own hometown in a dancing act.
I'm going into a new business. Why, only this afternoon I made $200.
$200?
Yes, that's why I was late for the wedding.
Well, that makes it a little different. Oh, I'm not consenting to your wedding, but, you know, I always admire any young man that can make money. It shows, well, it shows character.
That's too kind of you, sir.
Oh, not at all.
Then Margaret and I can get married, sir.
Well, you go to New York and work hard at your business. And if you're successful, you can come back here and ask me for my Margaret.
oh, Daddy.
And in all probability, I'll be very happy to give it to you.
It's a clip from Swing Time. A lot of fun with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. And of course, money cures all the ills on that one. You can skip your wedding, but he made $200, so it's okay.
It's kind of one of those great Depression-era madcap romantic comedies with some great song and dance numbers. It's at the top of its genre. And that's something we see with George Stevens. He'll pop in, like you said, Jimmy, he's very versatile. He'll take on every genre, and more often than not, he makes one of the better examples of said genre. And Swing Time is right there.
And let's move on. We want to cover a lot of territory here with George Stevens as director and cinematographer. But, boy, the next film, if you haven't seen it, it's one of those ones that you must see it if you're into one of the best adventure films. And from 1939, Gunga Din just holds up as well as any adventure flick. I also feel, I wonder, I would love to find maybe some words of wisdom from John Huston, what he felt about Gunga Din, because I think of, Gunga Din based on the writing of Rudyard Kipling. I think it was based on a poem, perhaps, and here is John Huston, who in the 1980s, the film I always talk about, The Man Who Would Be King, is also based on Rudyard Kipling. But I think of Huston with The Man Who Would Be King, as well as perhaps The Treasure of Sierra Madre, using Gunga Din for a template of mixing adventure and thrills and, boy, biting your nails adventure with humor. I mean, these guys are funny. I mean, they're the masters of all situations. They're not worried about their skins. They can get out of any scrape, and they're always wisecracking. So after they get into, the ultimate scrapes, I mean, they're ribbing each other. And, of course, what I love of the undercurrent of Gunga Din is Douglas Fairbanks Jr. is going to quit the Army and get married and quit,
And, of course, Cary Grant and Victor McLaughlin, who are his Army buddies, are determined for this not to happen. This film, it's such a wonderful, it's a great adventure film. It's a great comedy. It's really just wonderful American movie making at its absolute finest, Jimmy. I mean, this genre of film was around at that time. You think of Charge of the Light Brigade with Errol Flynn, Lives of a Bengal Lancer with Gary Cooper, Beau Geste with Gary Cooper, and here comes Gunga Din. And the difference between Gunga Din and these other films I mentioned, all of which are great. Don't get me wrong. The thing is, they're all outstanding films. But Gunga Din has some humor to it, like you said. And it seems like I was listening to you speak about this in terms of John Huston and the template for his later film, Man Who Would Be King and Treasure of Sierra Madre. And I could see him as a young man watching this in a theater going, now that's a movie. Yeah. And really, I mean, I could definitely see its influence. The way it's shot, I mean, it's beautifully shot. The man, George Stevens, just had such an eye. He's not only a great filmmaker, he's a filmmaker, a director and cinematographer and screenwriter all in one, and it's just amazing. This is so much fun. It's from 1939, and you know what, folks? It still plays well. Let's not forget the immortal Sam Jaffe, who plays Gunga Din.
Yes. And again, this is a film that grabs you by the nape of the neck at the beginning and just takes you for the ride. And I do believe it's difficult, truly difficult, to mix, a slam bang adventure yarn with the comedy that comes up in this film. Because I mean, coming out of Gunga Din, just watching some of it recently, I was thinking, is this a comedy? Is it an adventure? Well, it's a mixture of things, and it all works so perfectly. And he also, I mean, there's small things that George Stevens does just to move a story along, to keep the narrative drive going. Like near the beginning, there's a guy with a what do you call it? The Morse code, where
right.
And he's sending a message, and they're about to be attacked, right? Well, you go to the other end of the receiving end, and you hear the da 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 da, and then it stops, and they're all sort of sitting there looking at each other, and you know that the guy at the Morse code button has just been killed or massacred, and it's just you're sitting there and you don't see what happened, but you know what happened when that that little Morse code stops. And in watching a lot of George Stevens films, he does little things like that move everything along and just keep you in suspense just masterfully.
And I think it's fair to mention that Cary Grant is incredible in this picture.
He is.
At this time, I mean, he was always kind of like some, one of the kings of this sophisticated Depression-era comedy, wearing the tuxedo and always pouring the right drink and, all that stuff, and very good at the rapier-witted repartee. That's pretty good, huh?
I like that.
But here he is, he's strapping it on for a little adventure, and he's not afraid to use his fists, shoot guys. He's rough and tumble, as is Victor McLaughlin and the always wonderful Doug Fairbanks Jr. This is a gas, and I think we got a clip from it.
Here's right after a major battle, major chaos and mayhem, and our three main characters in Gunga Din are walking. Here it is. This is from George Stevens' Gunga Din.
What's the matter, Bell? You've been wool gathering ever since we crawled out of the river.
Well, my time is up on May the 14th.
Well, what of that? You can sign on for another 9 years, can't you? Make a man out of him, huh?
I'm leaving the service.
Leaving the service?
That's right. I'm getting married and I'm going in the tea business.
Married? Tea business? Why, you're mad if it... March your attention, everybody! Let's march in good style, men! Left!
Pull up the
left! Left! Right! Left!
That's a bit from Gunga Din, and what's great about that little side story is it continues, They have more battles and craziness, but then, there's the actual marriage and things like that. It's great. It's just the way he ties all these pieces together in this just great adventure yarn.
It's a lot of fun. Jim, every time I see this film, I just get like a warm and fuzzy feeling inside. I really love this movie.
And Bob, I don't want to, I'm going to ruin it for those who want to watch this film and just get taken away by its, the way it looks like it's in another part of the world. It was filmed here in California, unfortunately. I'm ruined it for everybody, but
beautifully filmed.
Beautifully filmed, but folks, that's California in Gunga Din, the great eye of George Stevens. You're listening to Take Two, the movie program on Public Radio, KCBX San Luis Obispo, KSBX Santa Barbara. We're streaming across the world at kcbx.org. Our focus tonight, the great director, screenwriter, cinematographer, and producer, George Stevens. Coming up after the break, we have some amazing work that he did during World War II. Back in a moment.
You're listening to Take Two on Public Radio, KCBX San Luis Obispo, KSBX Santa Barbara, streaming at kcbx.org, and you can write to us at movies@kcbx.org.
Support for KCBX comes from the Mid-State Fair and Bob Dylan's performance there on July 27th. Performance information and tickets are available at the website, midstatefair.com.
Support for KCBX also comes from Mission Community Bank and their Community Club. At the Community Club, local listeners can help fund substantial grants for local nonprofits while enjoying premium banking services. MissionCommunityBank.com.
We're back on Take Two, the movie program on Public Radio KCBX. My name is Jim Dee. I'm here with Bob Whiteford, and we're talking about the great American director George Stevens and his brilliant career. And what's interesting, one of the most interesting things on doing this show or getting prepared for this show, Bob, was, of course, noting that George Stevens did pass away in 1975, but in 1999, films of his were released that had never been released before. And what we're talking about is something called D-Day, the color footage. I think it also has a little bit of a different title. And this is, the reason we want to talk about this now is we're in the getting into the 1940s, and during that time, George Stevens and a whole bunch of other folks went abroad to chronicle World War II. And, well, I shouldn't even mention it. We have George Stevens Jr. talking about it. But I got to say, Bob, looking at this color footage of World War II, it's interesting because you think of World War II with the actual footage in black and white. This is some of the only footage in color that was filmed in the front lines. It's incredible.
Well, you know, this is a really interesting story, Jim. And I look at this from a few different angles. Big part of this was they weren't even supposed to be filming in color. It was against regulations. And what happened was George Stevens was the commander of a film unit in the U.S. Army. And his job was to chronicle D-Day, the invasion, and then the march across Europe to liberate the occupied countries like France, Holland, Denmark, etc. The march across Western Europe. In this unit were people like Irwin Shaw, the writer, people like Russ Meyer. We discussed him as well.
That's right.
He was a combat cameraman. There were a few other people. Greg Toland was in this unit. And what's interesting about this is this had a major effect upon him as a person and as an artist. Think about this, Jimmy. We've touched upon this before on this show. I think about Haskell Wexler's excellent film from 1968-69, Medium Cool, with Robert Forster, where the cameraman is filming something. At that time, it had something to do with Martin Luther King, the night he was assassinated. And the actress with Robert Forster, Verna Bloom, one of our favorites, is saying what a great man he was and what a terrible thing he was killed. And Robert Forster is going, oh, that's a Panaflex 359 lens with the widescreen. And the Wexler's point is quite clear. It's like there are certain people that when they film, they're just looking at the technical aspects. They're almost not seeing what it is they're filming. In fact, this is discussed a lot now with people that are filming stuff on their cameras or on their cell phones as things happen, how you're not in the situation when it's happening. Now, George Stevens, I believe, is a case that went the other way.
I think so, too.
As he looked through the lens and he saw the destruction, because Western Europe was absolutely destroyed by us and by the Germans in that part of World War II. When he looked through the lens and saw dead people, when he looked through the lens at dead soldiers, ours and the Germans, and especially when he looked through the lens at the concentration camps like Dachau, it had an effect on him, a deep and profound effect. I mean, you can see in his films there's a sensitivity there, and that it could be by modern standards considered kind of sappy and whatnot. So imagine a person with those sensibilities looking through the lens at some horrible sights, and I think this really changed him as an artist. In some ways, for the better, because he didn't really, light and fuzzy wasn't really part of his nature anymore after this. And the footage that he shot is outstanding.
It is. I mean, I need to go back and see all of it, but this was the most intriguing aspect of this research.
Now think about this too, Jimmy, with Ken Burns's miniseries coming up on PBS. This ain't a plug, by the way, folks, but it's coming up, I think, in the fall on World War II, entitled The War.
Oh.
I'll bet you anything, especially when he's talking about Western Europe after D-Day. They'll be using a lot of George Stevens footage.
Well, folks, if you can find this, it's under a few titles, but D-Day, the color footage is one of the titles. And here is George Stevens Jr., the son of George Stevens, who introduces it, and he basically lays it out and hopefully whets your appetite to seek this out.
My father was George Stevens, the film director. He started out as a cameraman, and before the war he directed films like Alice Adams with Katharine Hepburn, Gunga Din, and Swing Time with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. He left Hollywood in 1942 to serve in the Army Signal Corps, and he was assigned by General Eisenhower to organize the motion picture coverage of the war in Europe. His special coverage unit shot 35mm black and white film, and much of it became the record by which we remember the war. He also took along his own 16mm camera and some Kodachrome film. With it, he and the men who traveled in his Jeep shot a kind of personal diary. And from time to time, he sent the film home in these boxes to our house near Toluca Lake in North Hollywood. After the war, the color film ended up in a storeroom where my father kept the things that were important to him. For decades, these boxes of film remained there, unexamined, until after his death. You are about to see the war as my father and his colleagues saw it, and hear their recollections of those times when each day was an adventure and hopes for the world ran high.
That's the voice of George Stevens Jr., son of George Stevens, and talking about the color footage that his father shot during World War II. And, you know, it's really great when he's introducing this, Bob, in this film. He's sitting on a desk, and here are these little piles of what, well, I grew up shooting 8mm film, and the boxes aren't that much bigger. And here is this, you know, they're just these few boxes sitting on the desk of 16mm film. But what a chronicle, what historic footage, and they're just, you know, they look like somebody's home movies, which they kind of were.
Absolutely, Jimmy, and that's what's amazing about this. It's a lot of it just them sitting around in their camp, you know, shaving, talking, doing things that are not necessarily heroic, but they're there. And then suddenly there's scenes of battlefield carnage. There's also scenes of Paris and a lot of Brussels when they were liberated, and the mad frenzy that was in color. And it's just amazing. This is a snapshot that we've never seen of that war. And I think historically, I think artistically, all those films are of really high merit. And Stevens, like as he approached everything else, did a first-rate job.
Check out a George Stevens film and then look for D-Day, the color footage. It's really something to see. Well, let's move on now. We're still in the 40s, and boy, you know, George Stevens hitting a home run with the next film we do want to discuss is Woman of the Year, which is the first team up of Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn. And, you know, we should mention that he was making other films. He made Vigil in the Night in 1940, Penny Serenade in 1941, 1942, Woman of the Year. This is before he ended up going over to do the war footage. But folks, I mean, what better team-up can you imagine? And under the great directorial hand of George Stevens, we're talking Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn, the beginning of a wonderful friendship on screen and off.
This is interesting, Jimmy. I mean, here he goes again, bringing a great team together.
Yes.
As he did with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. He now brings together perhaps the greatest male-female romantic comedy team of them all. And, of course, we're talking about Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn. This is their first teaming. This is a wonderful movie. It's a lot of fun. And boy, you really see the sparks fly. The table's set for a cinematic relationship and a real-life romantic relationship that would last until 1967, 25 years. And this is their first pairing. This is a wonderful film.
You know what's really fun, Bob, too, is we mentioned the earlier film, Alice Adams with Katharine Hepburn, and this film is almost sort of a reversal of some roles in this, as opposed to Alice Adams with the down-home, very sort of modest woman that she is. Woman of the Year, Katharine Hepburn is almost indestructible, and she's this incredible woman who can speak 20 languages, and Spencer Tracy is sort of the regular guy who's the sports writer and just, speaks one language sort of okay, But also I noticed in this film, too, that muted slapstick humor. I mean, there's some very funny moments in this film. Spencer Tracy, with some great odd looks and some bumbling, which is, again, I think of Stevens incorporating this wonderful humor into these films that dates back to his Hal Roach days, probably. But let's listen to a cut from, a clip from Woman of the Year. Here's a Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn. They've been wanting to get together for a long time. They've been missing each other because they're both so busy. And they sit down at a bar and they said, hey, we're finally together, so they're going to have some drinks. Served to them by the bartender, who is our own favorite, William Bendix. But finally here, Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn get to hang out a little bit, have a few drinks in Woman of the Year.
Well, we're alone. Talk. You do have something to talk about.
Yeah, you. I'd like to know what you like and what you don't like, and how you feel about being you.
I feel very good about it. Always have. I like knowing more about what goes on than most people.
And telling him.
Yeah, and telling him.
Thanks, Joe. A lot of drinking these.
Oh, I don't know.
Well, I'm just mean if you're not used to them,
Oh, don't worry about me. As a diplomat's daughter, I've had to match drinks with a lot of people. From remittance men to international spies. And I may say I've never wound up under the table.
Reminds me of my year at college. We used to bet on drinking. Make a contest out of it. Kid stuff.
Imagine. Silly.
That's Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy and Woman of the Year. And here's the human part, Bob. I mean, here's the indestructible Katharine Hepburn, who is amazing in this film. But at this scene, she kind of talks about, well, I've had drinks with the best of them, and I never end up under the table. Well, the next scene, she's under the table. and here's that humanity. I tend to think that George Stevens likes to, create the nuanced characterization here, and the fact that she does have fault isn't the word, but I mean, she's not as indestructible and invincible as she portrays to be. And it took being with Spencer Tracy, have a few drinks, and you realize, she isn't she's the Woman of the Year, to be sure, but she does have a few, shortcomings, let's just say.
And it's okay.
It's okay.
And it's
makes
fun.
It great.
That's what fuels the film and brings the fun to the table. My favorite part is when they go to the ball game together, and she has no idea what's going on.
Yeah.
And Spence is stuck having to try to explain it to her. She's up with all the sports writers, and they're all getting kind of annoyed with her. What a great film. I love this film.
Directed by George Stevens, and just that great touch that, I think of Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn helping make this film happen, and George Stevens, but I think there's sort of, there's a give and take here, in the fact that his fine direction, propelled this great cinematic team to success.
Absolutely, Jimmy, and I think it's a great example, along with More the Merrier with Joel McCrea, of that type of film that he made before World War II. and this would all change as after the war and with his return.
And what's interesting, too, is after he does return, the motion pictures that George Stevens made, That Justice Be Done, Nazi concentration camps, which I'm not sure if that's a feature or not. Another film in 1945 called The Nazi Plan. In 1948, the classic I Remember Mama, that was a huge hit. And then in 1951, probably considered his greatest film as far as notoriety and success, A Place in the Sun, which won him an Oscar for Best Director. And of course, Montgomery Clift and Elizabeth Taylor and
Shelley Winters. This is a fantastic movie. I mean, how would you classify this? It's got those dark elements. It could almost be a film noir, but it's not. I mean, it's an adaptation of an American tragedy, yet the acting, Montgomery Clift is fantastic in this.
He makes this movie because it's his emotional core, and you kind of see what the pain that he endures with Shelley Winters and falling in love with Elizabeth Taylor. And, of course, near the end of the film, it turns into a courtroom drama, which has a very interesting ending, I think. And the ever-present lawyer Raymond Burr.
Yeah, I think this is the first time Raymond Burr is on the right side of the law. This probably is the role that helped nail him down Perry Mason a few years down the road. The thing about this film, Jim, amongst many, that's kind of interesting is Montgomery Clift gets Shelley Winters pregnant, and she's haranguing him to do the right thing, which is marry her, which he obviously doesn't want to do.
No.
And it's not that he's not in love with her. And when she kind of talks on that boat about the life they're going to have together and how much she's going to love him because she thinks he's given in to her, it's painful to listen to.
Oh, it is.
And then he kills her. He drowns her. And the thing is, this is kind of an interesting film, Jim, because Montgomery Clift does a really reprehensible thing. He kills a woman he got pregnant. And yet, we somewhat empathize with him. Mm-hmm. And this is, I think, a tribute to Clift's range as an actor, a much underrated American actor, great actor, in the same vein as Marlon Brando, but also the direction of Stevens. It isn't, all the decisions aren't quite as ham-fisted or lopsided or made for you. He's a good guy who's done a bad thing. We feel for him, but yet it's like you feel like he didn't have any other choice, but it's still a terrible thing. Mm-hmm. And after he does this horrible thing, then suddenly everything he ever wanted falls right in his lap. A beautiful, rich young woman is madly in love with him. Her well-to-do family, it's all coming his way.
Mm-hmm.
But it ain't meant to be, because he gained it through doing something horrible. And the way at the end Monty Clift goes off to meet his fate with his head held high is kind of interesting too.
It really is.
This is a great film. This is great cinema. This is one of the greatest American films of all time. And was this even on that dopey list?
Let's not bring up the list.
Yeah, I don't even think it was. Further proof that that's just a bunch of crap.
Referring to the AFI list that we were ragging on a week ago or so. Let's listen to a clip from A Place in the Sun. This is Montgomery Clift and Raymond Burr pretty much grabbing him as the murderer of Shelley Winters from A Place in the Sun, directed by George Stevens.
Mr. Marlowe, here's your baby.
You're George Eastman. I suppose you know what you're charged with.
No.
I suppose you don't know anything about the murder of Alice Tripp.
I'm not guilty.
Oh, come on, son. We have the evidence. You're not going to deny it, are you?
Yes, I deny it.
Well, in that case, there's nothing to do but take you over to the vicar's house and see what your friends have to say about you.
Please, don't take me back there. I'll tell you all I can. Don't take me back there.
I didn't intend to, son. I just wanted to see what you'd have to say. Take him to Warsaw, boys, and lock him up.
The familiar voice of Raymond Burr is the lawyer, and that's Montgomery Clift, who is going off to his trial in George Stevens' A Place in the Sun. Well, let's move on now. We have a little bit more to cover on our great tribute to the great George Stevens. Right after Place in the Sun, Something to Live For he made in 1952. In 1953, he made Shane. 1956, 3 years later, the epic Giant, with superb performances from Rock Hudson, Elizabeth Taylor, and James Dean.
And let's not forget that Dennis Hopper was in this film, Salminio. I mean, it's loaded with people, and it's an episodic kind of film. It's the kind of film that was being churned out a lot in the 50s, and I think this harkens back to what we've been touching on repeatedly, Jimmy, is he'll take the current genre. This is like a film Douglas Sirk was making, Ross Hunter, etc., and he elevates it to another level. I mean, this film, it has a lot to say about power, about greed, about vengeance, about bigotry, and it's an awesome film. I mean, awesome in its scope.
Huge.
It is, in fact, quite giant.
Yeah, it's about 3.5 hours long, and I want to make sure that I get this across correctly. It's like this sprawling, incredible, epic soap opera, and when I use the term soap opera, I want to use it in the best possible way, because we're talking about, as you said, generational things, or all these characters, and it's an amazing film. And before we play our clip from Giant with James Dean with his oil strike, I do want to make mention about George Stevens, who is an outspoken champion for the art of cinema. He did come out and talk about television when it was, I think Rod Serling, we had some clips of him talking with Mike Wallace, of course, they're both chain smoking, but Rod Serling talking about some of his plays that he wrote, or some of his productions on television getting cut and commercials inserted. And George Stevens, talking about television, said a motion picture should be respected as being more than a tool for selling soap, toothpaste, deodorant, used cars, beer, and the whole gamut of products advertised on television. The audience, too, should be respected by being presented with a film as they remember it, and for those who have not seen it, as it was intended to be seen. Anything less is a degradation of the film and its audience. That's George Stevens talking about television back in the 50s.
Wow, I wonder what he would think about product placement in some of the movies today.
Oh, boy.
I don't think he'd like it very much, Jimmy.
Here's a scene from Giant from 1956, and in the scene, Elizabeth Taylor, Rock Hudson, and James Dean.
My welcome in, babe.
Fine.
Why, that's wonderful, Jan.
Everybody thought I had a duster? Y'all thought old Spindle Top old Burnett was all it was, didn't you? Well, I'm here to tell you it ain't, boy. It's here. And there ain't a dang thing you gonna do about it. My well came in big, so big, and there's more down there, and there's bigger wells. I'm rich, baby. I'm a rich one. I'm a rich boy. Me, I'm gonna have more money than you ever thought you could have. You and all the rest of you stinking sons of Benedicts.
Leslie, you go out in the house. Take the women with you.
Jack, we're real glad you struck him. Now you go on along home.
That's from Giant, directed by George Stevens, James Dean, Rock Hudson, and Elizabeth Taylor. Folks, get yourself some time, grab Giant and spends 3.5 hours with a great film, gorgeous to look at, and some great stars. Folks, we got to end up now with George Stevens and his last few films. After Giant, amazing Quantum Leap. 3 years later with The Diary of Anne Frank. He also made The Greatest Story Ever Told in 1965, The Only Game in Town in 1970. But here again, moving back to The Diary of Anne Frank, which he made after Giant, just such a diversity of subject matter. And you look at Giant, it's this gorgeous, glistening color spectacle, and then you watch Diary of Anne Frank, which is filmed in black and white with dark and a lot of contrasting tones. I mean, it's amazing to see what George Stevens does from film to film. And just so we don't have a little less time left, here's a clip from The Diary of Anne Frank. The Frank family is taking in Ed Wynn, who's a refugee, and just listen to this dialogue with Ed Wynn from George Stevens' The Diary of Anne Frank.
I'm dreaming, I know it. Mr. Otto Frank here. You're not in Switzerland then? Someone said that you had escaped to Switzerland. And you've been here all this time?
Ever since July.
Did Mr. Carla warn you you won't get much to eat here? You can imagine. 3 ration cards among the 7 of us. Now you make 8.
Mr. Van Daan, you don't realize what's happening outside, that you should warn me of a thing like that. You don't realize what's going on. Right here in Amsterdam, every day hundreds of Jews disappear. Every day children come home from school to find their parents gone. Hundreds are being deported. People that you and I know, the Hollensteins, the Wessels.
Oh, no.
You get your call-up notice, come to the station on such and such a day and hour. Bring only what you can carry. If you don't go, they come and drag you from your home and ship you off to Mauthausen, the death camp.
We didn't know that things had got so much worse.
Forgive me for speaking so.
Do you know the DeVries?
They're gone.
Son and I are in the same class. Son is my best friend.
She returned home from school to find her parents gone. She was alone for 2 days, and then they came and took her away.
Wow, that's Ed Wynn from George Stevens' The Diary of Anne Frank. And again, Bob, there's that. Ed Wynn, I think of him as, character actor. Maybe you remember him from Mary Poppins. He's sort of a jolly guy. But what is so sobering and amazing about George Stevens in this clip, where he has Ed Wynn very cool, very calm. He's this nice old man, but he's talking about these incredible atrocities going on. And I was watching the scene and just riveted, and I just knew that the director's hand was doing something there as far as this very cool, calm assessment of these horrific events. So there you have it, folks. George Stevens, check out his films, and what a pleasure to talk about this great American director.
Absolutely, Jimmy. What a real pleasure this last hour has been. Look, it's gone already.
Wow.
Which means it was a lot of fun. I had a gas tonight.
Thanks to Annie Harp, our projectionist. Thanks to Dave Salton for the recommendation. You can write to us at movies@kcbx.org. We'll see you again next time on Take Two.